Fred Celec, until recently, was Assistant to the Secretary of Defense for Nuclear, Chemical, and Biological Defense Programs. As such, this made him the senior official in the Obama administration as an advisor to the Secretary of Defense on weapons of mass destruction. Fred has had a long and distinguished career in the Department of Defense as the senior official overseeing nuclear weapons and strategy. He served on the EMP Commission staff while working for the Institute for Defense Analyses.
The question is, should we be worried about EMP? During the Cold War, the Department of Defense took the threat of an EMP attack very seriously. Strategic systems were designed, built, tested, and periodically retested to assure that they could survive an EMP attack and still perform their intended mission. Minuteman I, which was one of the first ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, for example, was not built hardened against EMP and was required to undergo a hardening retrofit that some estimates said cost 50% of the initial procurement cost. That kind of gave EMP a dirty name for many years, which linger even today. But every strategic system after that was built to survive. And costs to EMP harden something range in the 1% to 2% to potentially as high as 15%, depending on how many you're going to make and what kind of hardening you have to do and that sort of thing. But this is only if hardening is part of the initial design and not retrofitted. As a result, in some cases, only part of a system would be hardened in order to save money. The B-52, for example, the bomber, had hardened avionics, but the rest of the system was not hardened. The thinking was that the rest of the system was either not vulnerable to EMP or could be quickly reset or bypassed, so hardening was not necessary. Our aerial refueling fleet was not hardened against EMP because the thinking was that only a small fraction of the fleet would be airborne at any one time and could therefore be quickly replaced if we had an EMP attack. The B-1, B-2, and cruise missiles were all designed and built hard. The Army required that equipment designated combat essential, and put that in quotes, be hardened, and the Navy required that all elements of the SLBM, the Fleet Ballistic Missile Systems, be hardened. Essential communications were either hardened, duplicated, or alternatives were found to ensure that the President maintained the capability to control the launch of our nuclear deterrent. Again, this is during the Cold War. So-called tactical systems were not hardened, and these included the Air Force Fighter Force, for example, most Navy ships and aircraft, and most Army equipment. Like America everywhere, the Department of Defense took advantage of the peace dividend resulting from the end of the Cold War. Hardness maintenance programs were reduced or canceled outright. Strategic communication survivability was reduced to what was appropriately called a thin line, and then Congress got involved. The Navy had built a large EMP simulator on a barge in order to test EMP hardness of ships. The simulator was called Empress, kind of almost like the name here today. The intent was to tow it out of the Chesapeake Bay just off the Patuxent Naval Air Station and perform the tests on full-scale ships. Anti-nuclear protesters convinced the Congress that such tests would endanger the public, although there was no scientific evidence of that then, or even now for that matter. Congress directed that the tests be performed offshore. But the Save the Whales and the other protest groups complained that such testing would harm fish and mammals. So Congress enacted legislation directing the Navy to dismantle Empress and in effect give up full-scale EMP testing of ships. To its credit, the Navy continues to do injection testing and low-level testing in an attempt to assure that there are no EMP vulnerabilities. In addition, the Navy must pay close attention to EMR, and we heard a little bit about that earlier, which is the interference, the electromagnetic interference from one piece of equipment to another. Radios and radars operating on the same ship, for example. They have to be careful about that. Many of the things that the Navy must do for EMR protection provide some degree of EMP protection, although it's not a perfect match. Since the end of the Cold War, neither the Air Force nor the Navy have introduced any new strategic systems, so EMP hardening of those systems is moot. The Army continues to require combat essential equipment to be hardened, but the requirement has been relaxed so that they put it into trade space with cost and schedule, so if the program manager needs a few bucks, he can take it out of the hardening budget to put somewhere else. And so even then, in addition, only the initial piece of equipment is tested. And if they're going to run 10,000 of these things and they're supposed to be EMP hardened, they'll test the very first one off the production line and everything else is assumed hardened. Then Congress established the EMP Commission. The first report produced by the Commission was a classified report that Peter alluded to on the military capabilities. The report in essence said that while EMP hardening was a major effort during the Cold War, it had been so seriously neglected that survivability of the strategic deterrent was questionable. This obviously got the attention of the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and they ordered a review of our entire deterrent to determine its vulnerability. As a result, there is renewed emphasis on assuring that DoD systems intended to be hard are indeed maintained hard and hard. The Secretary requires periodic reviews that report to him on progress or lack thereof, and the DoD is once again paying attention to EMP hardening thanks to the prodding of the Commission. In addition, Congress enacted legislation requiring that DoD report every 2 years on the status and progress of EMP protection for our strategic systems. For my part, when I was the Assistant Secretary, as Peter mentioned, I directed that the Defense Science Board establish a task force, a standing task force to meet that requirement. I don't know if the current administration is going to continue that or not. But this is not the Cold War. Okay, those are Cold War issues and post-Cold War issues. What's changed? For one, an EMP attack during the Cold War was presumed to be a precursor to a major exchange of nuclear weapons. So survivability for extended periods was not necessary. We weren't going to survive. Today, an EMP attack might be the only nuclear shot fired. But there are consequences for the military, and the consequences are tremendous. For example, as you've seen earlier in some of the earlier presentations, today's military rely on commercial electric power in order for any of its forces outside of its strategic forces to function. Without electric power, troops can't move, aircraft cannot deliver supplies, equipment can't even be fueled. Battlefield communications, the trump card for the American fighting forces, would become non-existent. For this reason, the military is paying attention to EMP hardening and survivability. But my initial question was, should we be worried about EMP? And the answer is an emphatic yes.